Seti I, Pharaoh of Egypt, is one of the underappreciated film stars from Hollywood depictions of the culture. You might think that Rameses is more important, but Seti actually appears in more films than his son. Today we have a wonderful project, The Prince of Egypt from 1998. This was directed by Brenda Chapman, Steve Hickner, and Simon Wells, and produced by DreamWorks Animation. And although it is another adaptation of the Exodus story, it is a much more lively and dynamic one than the Ten Commandments from 1956. They each have their own place in film history. Like the Ten Commandments, which we covered previously, it's an adaptation of the Exodus story, which you can find in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and the Islamic Quran. And with that in mind, its depiction of Seti I, Rameses, and the Egyptians is going to conform to the Exodus narrative in the broad strokes. But this film does have an interesting take on Seti, one that, personally, I quite appreciate, both in a historical and a dramatic sense. Let's explore. So the film opens with a musical number about the captivity of the Hebrews and their suffering under Egyptian rule. We're not going to comment too much on that because we're focusing on Seti. Obviously that's a part of the Exodus story which we can explore properly another time. Regardless of any historical accuracy questions, these songs are absolutely killer, and that's a consistent feature of the soundtrack. So we really got to give credit to the filmmakers for that. So once again in these early scenes, we go through the abandonment of Moses onto the river and his finding by the Egyptian princess, although in this case it's the queen Tuya, who is actually the mother of Rameses II and the wife of Seti. Usually the princess is depicted as a slightly older generation, but here it's Tuya. So we get our introductory scene to young Rameses and to Moses, his adopted brother. The depiction of Rameses deserves a shout out because he consistently has this side lock which indicates youth, which in this characterization of the ruler is totally on point. He's very youthful, impetuous, and much more of a child than a proper crown prince. And I think the iconography carries that, at least for an Egyptologist. So now we meet Seti, and what an entrance. The crook, or heka, comes down into his palm, and we're immediately confronted with a figure who's much more of a disciplinarian than the depiction in the Ten Commandments. He's voiced by Patrick Stewart, and this is a great performance. He is stern, authoritative, and you can absolutely see why Rameses II is both in awe of him and afraid to disappoint him. And the first glimpse we get of Seti is just his crook and his fist, both of which are in shadow. And thematically that's going to be important because the shadow of Seti will loom large over the entire story, even after he departs it. And then the first time we see Seti, he says this,
"Be still, Pharaoh speaks,"
which is an excellent introduction to the role he's going to play. He is not really a father, he is a monarch, a ruler, and he is going to impact every part of this story. It's just excellent directing, scripting, and editing in terms of a character introduction. Then we also have these beautiful wide shots where Seti is literally framed by the columns of his palace and the colossal statue of his own head. We have to give the filmmakers some creative license here. That statue is way too big, even by the standards of Egyptian colossi. But it's a beautiful shot, and it really thematically communicates what is happening. Now we get the killer line. I distinctly remember this was in all of the trailers before the film was released. Rameses says that one broken statue doesn't destroy much, but then Seti says,
"But one weak link can break the chain of a mighty dynasty."
And it's absolutely peak. It also communicates Ramesses' motivation perfectly. Unlike the Ten Commandments from 1956, Rameses is not jealous of Moses or afraid that he's going to usurp his position. Instead, here Rameses is focused on Seti. Rameses himself is, in a sense, a slave to the expectations of history, the religious lineage of the pharaohs, and the crushing weight of a father's own judgments. It's just an excellently communicated motivation, and this scene hits every note on point. I have to give a particular shout out to the depiction of Tuya, or Tuya, who is the wife of Seti I and the mother of Rameses II. The costuming doesn't have the same detail as we find in the Ten Commandments. Obviously that would be really hard to animate, but the design of her wig and the overall silhouette she communicates is kind of an exaggerated version of what we find in ancient Egyptian art. And it's really quite beautiful. When Seti speaks directly to Moses himself, have to give a shout out to the depiction of the king facially. They clearly studied Seti's mummy, which was at the time in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, because the lines of his jaw, his cheeks, and his nose are all quite similar to the actual Seti. With that statue in the background looming over everything, it's just beautiful imagery. So again, the story is about Moses and it's focused on his personal and religious journey, so we don't see Seti for an extended period of time. The next time we catch up with him is an interesting scene. It's not one that's part of the biblical tradition, and it's certainly not part of any Egyptian historical tradition, but Moses is forced to confront the history of what supposedly happened to the Hebrew children, and thus his own place within it. This whole scene of the Pharaoh commanding the murder of children is beautifully animated. It's always a fun idea when you see ancient Egyptian art, the two-dimensional stuff, turned into sort of moving animation like this, and the way they have soldiers running along different columns is really quite lovely. Most of this actual imagery is not the sort of stuff you see in ancient Egyptian art. You will see soldiers attacking towns and villages, but you don't tend to see the villages themselves. You'll see a fortified city with the people hiding up in the towers going, "No, please don't kill us." But here they're trying to tell a story, so they make it up as they need to. And it's a pretty good depiction as far as things go. Random timeline correction. While I was editing the video, I realized that in the story, Moses seems to be about 16 to 20 years old when this is taking place. We know that Seti I only reigned for about 10 to 11 years. And just before him, his father, Ramesses I, only reigned for 1 to 2 years at most. So logically, the murder of the Hebrew children, as this film depicts it, should have taken place just before Ramesses I, which would mean that it was the work of Horemheb. Horemheb actually started out as a general, an army commander under King Tutankhamun. But in the years after Tutankhamun died, Horemheb seized power for himself. Subsequently, he appointed Ramesses I as his designated heir, which actually started the 19th dynasty. The Prince of Egypt has simplified the timeline and just put it under Seti I, because this is a film for children, and you don't want to complicate matters too much. It also works better for dramatic purposes. Moses can speak directly to the man responsible for those murders. But if you want to take things historically, then really the murder should have happened under Horemheb. It's a dark moment, and I'm actually quite fond of Horemheb as a historical figure, but it is what it is. A couple of interesting background details here. At least twice we see an image of a sun disk with rays extending out from it. That is the classic Amarna depiction of the Aten, who is a form of the sun god Ra, but given a very specific manifestation by the pharaoh Akhenaten and his famous queen Nefertiti. The Aten himself was never particularly prominent or problematic for any pharaoh. Akhenaten was kind of abandoned and ignored by later rulers, including Seti, but the depiction of Aten here is not totally unreasonable within the time frame. What is a mistake is here. Moses is leaning back against a pillar, and in the background we can clearly see the cartouches of Akhenaten himself. Seti would never have allowed the name of Akhenaten to appear on any monument. He specifically omitted Akhenaten from things like lists of kings that appear within his temples, and the whole Ramesses family in general seems to have been utterly disinterested, even hostile, to Akhenaten and his regime. So that's a small error on the part of the filmmakers. You just wouldn't have found these cartouches in Seti's palace. But hey, it's fun. So now we get the last scene in which Seti actually appears, and this is his greater good speech. This is not terribly inconsistent with how the ancient Egyptians might have thought of such a thing. The whole concept of ma'at, or the divinely maintained order, could be viewed today as a sort of greater good motif. Again, this is Seti's last appearance in the film, and the next time we hear about him, Ramesses II has become the pharaoh. So overall, the Prince of Egypt is much more dramatic than the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments in 1956 was kind of slower and more ponderous in a pacing sense, and its depiction of Seti was much more of a kindly old man, indifferent to the system he rules, rather than anybody with true agency or determination. But here, Seti is very clearly motivated. Here, he is an authoritarian monarch, anxious to preserve stability and the continuity of his dynasty, and everything he does, either in the present of the film or in the past leading up to it, is done with that in mind. So he's a little bit more villainous, I guess, in a story sense, certainly more of an antagonist for young Moses and the Hebrews, whereas by comparison, the Ten Commandments version is more disinterested. There are other people doing the bad things on his behalf. But this Seti is much more hostile to the Hebrews, which arguably follows the biblical tradition a bit more closely than the Ten Commandments, but certainly doesn't give the best depiction of the Egyptians that you possibly could. Still, I think the depiction of Seti as a ruler concerned about lineage, stability, and tradition is not entirely hostile. It actually does give some understandable motivation to why the king behaves the way he does, and more importantly, it sets the themes that Rameses is going to follow as the actual pharaoh of the Exodus in the story. So the depiction of Seti here is really strong from a creative and a dramatic standpoint. Again, a lot of it has to be viewed in context of this is an adaptation of the Hebrew story of Exodus. It's not necessarily in line with the historical inscriptions from Egypt itself. But Seti I was a warrior and a builder, and a man who exercised monarchical power on a grand scale throughout the country. It's probably not too far away from reality to suggest that he might have been a stern, kind of controlling figure. Obviously, we should take that with salt. There's creative liberties and a need for storytelling, which overrides every other consideration. But the depiction of Seti here in The Prince of Egypt is actually pretty solid. I would say, character-wise, about a 7 out of 10.